Hello and welcome to Lesson 1-2, How the Brain Learns. Let's go ahead and dive right into this section. Learning is a collection of several factors. You have brain maturity, you have white and gray matter volume, and you have chemistry and cell connections. And in this video lecture, we're going to dive into a lot of these factors. All right. Now, the key that I want you to remember as we go through this lecture is that no two people learn exactly the same. How I learn best as an individual learner is not going to be how you learn best. Our goal in this initial unit is to teach you how you learn best, so going forward, not only in science, but all of your other classes, you'll be able to understand the types of lessons you're presented, how you learn best, and how you can leverage your strengths and also work on your weaknesses so that no matter how a lesson is presented, you will be able to learn as much of it and as fast as possible. Okay? So if you remember from the last lecture that we did, you probably remember this picture because it was in the last lecture. And this is a picture of a human brain dissected down the middle. And you can see we have part of the cerebellum in here, and we have a lot of white matter here, and the darker part is the gray matter. Okay? So learning is a factor of how much volume of white matter versus gray matter. And remember, white matter has that little thing in it, or those little bits and pieces called myelin. Okay, so myelin equals white matter. And no myelin is gray matter. Okay? So brain maturity. We will dive into this. So as your brain matures, meaning as you grow up, your brain gets more mature, meaning it provides a lot of functions a lot faster and will continue to set up learning off of the foundation that you gave it when you were a very young child growing through adolescence. And chemistry and cell connections we will dive into as well. So let's go ahead and continue on our journey of how the brain learns. Our first big word and really one of the only large words we'll cover in this video lesson is called neuroplasticity, or plasticity for short. And it really just boils down to how the brain reacts to outside stimuli, which results in knowledge. Okay? Let's give a really crude or rudimentary example of plasticity. You pick up an iron from the hot iron side. What happens? Your hand gets burnt, your nerve cells travel up to your brain, and it goes, "Why in the world did you just do that? Don't do that again." New connections were made. This was outside stimuli, was a hot iron. Your brain said, "That's not good." And knowledge is, "I'm never doing that again." Okay? So that's what plasticity is. Pruning is the process of cutting the connections down as you age. So let's take a look, or a closer look, at this image. We start at birth with relatively few connections between our neurons. And remember, neurons are what we call the cells in our brains. Okay? As we go through early childhood into around 6 years of age, you see a whole bunch of connections. On average, each neuron has 20 connections with other neurons at the age of roughly 6 years old. As we continue to grow up, and we get into 14 years, and it goes beyond 14 years, but you can see clearly the number of connections between brain cells is much fewer. And the process of cutting those connections over time is pruning. Okay? Just like the term in gardening, pruning is, you cut back a bush or a tree or whatever. In the brain, it happens as well. You cut back the number of connections. And that is normal brain development. If we have an individual that grows up and those connections are not pruned, we can result in a condition called autism. And I'm sure we've all heard of that phrase, heard of that disease. It is growing into commonplace in our society for several reasons, and stuff we won't get into in this lecture. But it usually is associated with a failure to prune back the number of unnecessary pathways. So let's take an example of this maze. Now, when we are young, and infants and toddlers and stuff like that, or someone who has autism, we have many different options. Our brain has many different options to get an impulse from one side of our brain to another. During very young age or autism, our brains explore every type of path. Okay? We try out every path. And eventually, our brain will find the correct path. As we age, as we get older, the number of neurons, the number of possible pathways for an impulse to get from one side of the cell to another get pruned back. And it becomes much clearer. Let me get rid of these guys for us. It gets much clearer on the correct path the impulse must take to get to the correct area. Okay? Now, this pruning does not happen, it looks like that still, to someone who may be 14 years of age but has autism. All right? So there is no, or a lack of pruning. Autism is also associated with two abnormalities in two physical structures of the brain, stuff we did touch on in our last video lecture. The one component or physical structure of the brain we associate with autism is an error in our corpus callosum. And if you remember, that was a portion of the brain around the cerebellum in the middle of the brain that connects our left hemisphere with our right hemisphere of the brain and allows signals to transfer back and forth. Okay, so that's what the corpus callosum does. It allows transmission back and forth between left and right hemispheres of the brain. It also could be, autism can be associated with an issue with the amygdala. And the amygdala is the center of emotions and emotional behavior in our brain. Okay? So these are the two physical structures that can be affected as a result of autism. Or, excuse me, autism can be a result of these two physical structures having a problem with them. Getting into the size of our brains. Our human brain has a mass of 1.3 to 1.5 kilograms, or roughly 3 pounds. That's how much a human brain weighs. The largest brain in our animal kingdom is the whale, or a certain species of whales, at 8 kilograms, or 17.5 pounds. Brain size, or brain volume, varies according to our body size. The more brain you have, the more volume your brain takes up, the higher your intelligence. So the bigger your brain, the bigger your intelligence. And the brain-body ratios are largest in mammals. So what that means is we have a really big brain for a relatively small body, gives us the largest brain-to-body ratio. And our cortex grows the most after birth. So this is the little squiggly portion of our brain, the outside portion of our brain. Okay, and again, you will learn that my artistic abilities stopped in kindergarten. Okay, there's my cerebral cortex. In doing the research for this particular unit, we discovered that males of our species, tend to have more gray matter volume, while women tend to have more white matter volume. So the old adage, let me go back to this slide here. The old adage, and I'll get rid of this. The old adage can be true. Men have a larger portion of gray matter, and gray matter is typically associated with logic, thinking, reasoning. So that's where you get a lot more guys or males tend to be more logically thinking. They have to think things through. They don't go off of their gut as much. And the white portion of our brain is typically associated more with emotions. So the stereotype of males are more pig-headed, they're more logical, they're stuck in their ways, tends to be because they have larger gray matter volume. And women, of the old adage, is the stereotype of women are more emotional than men, is because they have a larger white matter volume. Okay? And we also have a specific disease, attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, better known as ADHD, has shown that many studies have shown that they have a larger frontal lobe. And remember, that's the area of the brain, frontal lobe, that goes with reasoning and thinking and all of the higher order functions of our brain. That's the frontal lobe, and tend to have a higher IQ. And the issue that, or the problems that people with ADHD face, is they have a problem with focusing. And you can see they always are multitasking. Okay? And it tends to be an issue with the pathways. They don't have the normal, quote unquote, and take that for a grain of salt, because what is normal? Everyone's unique. Everyone has their strengths and their weaknesses. Their brains do not prioritize the impulses. So they may have, this is what I have to get done, but I also want to think about this and Susie and what Johnny said at lunch, and they're all competing for priority. A non-ADHD person would be able to easily prioritize, hey, that's what you need to focus on now, and Johnny, Susie, and what I'm wearing to the dance on Friday will take second priority and third priority and fourth priority. And it's not that someone with ADHD can't prioritize with practice and with certain skills and certain exercises they can do. They can easily prioritize their days as well, but it does take a little bit more effort in the beginning than someone that does not have ADHD or a larger frontal lobe. Okay, so let's move on from here into brain chemistry. And brain cells interact in two basic ways. They have physical connections between brain cells, and these are called neurons. So brain cells are neurons. Okay, so there are physical connections, and again we have an axon and we have a dendrite. And that is your physical connection. Okay, and that is typically an electrical connection. And we have chemical messengers that are shared between nearby brain cells, or what's called a neurotransmitter. And the structures look basically the same, with one major difference. There's a larger space in between them, and chemical reactions happen to allow the transmission to take place. So the difference between electrical connections and chemical connections are just simply chemical connections have more space to travel through. Okay? Most brain issues occur when one of these pathways is interrupted. So that's when we have issues with our brains. One of those can be, or another disease we'll look at, is Asperger's syndrome. And new studies suggest that nerves connect differently in the left hemisphere of the brain. Okay? And Asperger's syndrome is sort of, they've got a lot of different messages going on all at once, and they have a kind of a hard time filtering through all of the different signals. And then with ADHD, we have chemical messengers that kind of get lost on the way. So that would be your lost mail. All right. So let's say part of my brain says, hey, you need to focus on getting your homework done. So here's logic center traveling down a brain cell, a series of axons, series of brain cells. And somewhere along the way here, that signal of you need to get your homework done gets lost into, I wonder what's on TV. I wonder if I should do this. I wonder what's going on here. And the signal gets lost. And that's where they have a hard time prioritizing their all the things that they're thinking about at once. The brain learns in 3 steps. Okay, they learn by remodeling, and remodeling is the actual physical connection or new connection that takes place when learning occurs. When you learn to write your name, when you learn a new math formula or a new science formula or a new experiment or you see something on television you didn't know. When the actual physical act of new learning takes place, you actually get a new connection. Okay? So a physical new connection between neurons takes place, and that is called remodeling. And learning gets stronger through repetition. Think of it as you've got your first new connection, okay? And then you learn or read about the same subject matter again. Now you got a little bit thicker of a connection. And then you do it a third time through studying or through group discussion. And then you maybe do a project or a homework sheet. And here's a flashcard system. And over time, you can see that that connection gets thicker, that connection gets stronger. So the more repetition that you have, the stronger the connection. Okay? And finally, the use of that knowledge. So this is, I've got flashcards, I'm going to repeat it, I'm going to memorize it, and things are going to be hunky-dory. And I got a strong connection. But the actual use, I'm going to teach someone what I learned. That's when you get a much, much thicker connection. And just imagine that that's all colored in. And that's the stuff that hits into your long-term memory banks, that's in your temporal lobe, and doesn't go anywhere. Something that becomes ingrained. Okay? Like, how many of you know how to ride a bike? Hopefully most, if not all of you, right? You ever forget that? No. And why? Because you made a new connection of the balance needed to ride that bike. You constantly rode that bike, fell over, tripped, got off balance, and your body figured out with muscle memory and repetition the correct way to do it, and finally years and years of use has ingrained that connection of all, well, this will symbolize all the little connections took place for you to be able to ride a bike, because that's obviously a complex skill, but this is a very, very thick connection, okay? Now let's take this lecture as an example. You have a new connection, hopefully you've learned something new from this lecture. How many times are you going to review it? How many times are we going to talk about it? How many times are you going to go over this information to reinforce that connection? And then are you going to use this new knowledge to really make that strong connection so you don't forget it? And that's our goal, both between yourselves and myself, is to go through all three of these steps on everything we cover to make sure that you get this really strong connection. For some of you, that will come easier than others, depending on what type of lesson and what subject matter. Interest does play a part in the ease of learning. If you're interested in something, you're going to be more motivated to do this repetition. If you're not motivated, you're not going to get the repetition and need it to get a strong connection. And I thought this was really interesting, and we only got a couple more slides left, so bear with me here. And this is how the brain learns on the learning pyramid. And you'll see the numbers are a little bit different here, and that just means that it's in a range or different studies. Like this particular image was adapted from the National Training Laboratories, and this was from a different resource that we found, okay? So roughly 10% of what we read, we remember, we learn. 20% of what we hear, we learn. 30% of what we see, 50% of what we see and hear. So that's what I would consider this lecture being. You're seeing the information and you're hearing this information. So if we only left this lesson at this lecture and didn't use it the next day and for the next few days and the next weeks and the next months, you would only retain about half of the information that you were exposed to. If we go into a group discussion, you'll remember 70%. If you practice with it and you experience the information personally, you'll remember 80%. But look at this, 95% on this one and 90% on the learning pyramid is if you teach someone else this information, you will retain 95% of what you learned. So where do you think our goal is on most of our lessons? The ability to teach someone else, whether that's a younger sibling, a classmate, a friend, a parent. That's our goal. Learning happens when existing nerve cells make new connections. And this is as a review because we've gone over this, like rewiring a circuit. You plug in, here's an axon terminal, like I drew, but this is a prettier picture. A new axon plugs into a dendrite. So new connections, that remodeling takes place. The more times you experience the information, the stronger the connection gets. That's that repetition. Repetition gets stronger, stronger, stronger. Okay? So that's your review of how learning physically takes place inside your brain. New connections take place like a Lego or an erector set, or just plugging in something else, like let's say your nerve cell was your DVR or your television. And these are all new HDMI cables getting plugged in. Okay, new connections, new learning. And this is just a x-rayed picture of what your neural network looks like. Pretty cool, huh? And before I wrap up, I know you probably thought I forgot about it, but your video secret number for today's lesson is 47. So make sure you write 47 in your homework sheet for 1-2. Okay? So your secret number is number 47. Hope you learned a lot, and I will see you in the next lesson, which will be very soon. Bye now, guys.